Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be, and welcome to this, the first of a series of 3 webinars, where we'll be diving into more details from the World Energy Outlook 2024. So this was a report that we published back in October. It's the IEA's annual flagship report. It identifies and explores the biggest trends in energy demand and supply, as well as what they mean for energy security, emissions, and economic developments. Now, one of the key things that emerged from this year's reports is that we are emerging into an age of electricity. We've been through the ages of coal that started with the Industrial Revolution. We moved into the age of oil and gas, which we're still in, but we see that there's an accelerating pace of growth in demand for electricity. And in this webinar, we're going to be covering what's driving that growing demand for electricity and how that demand will be met by the power sector. Just to give a bit more background about the World Energy Outlook, it's centered around 3 scenarios. Each scenario has the same starting points and incorporates the latest data, energy supply and demand, markets, technology costs and policies, and also similar levels of future population and economic growth. None of these scenarios is a forecast. The scenario that you'll see most of the information is around what we call our stated policies scenario, that you'll see abbreviated as STEPS, steps. And this scenario provides a sense of the prevailing direction of travel for the energy sector based on a detailed reading of the latest policy settings in countries around the world. Alongside this, we have our announced pledges scenario, abbreviated to APS, which in addition to steps, this scenario assumes that all national energy and climate targets, including longer-term net zero emissions targets and pledges in nationally determined contributions, are met in full and on time. And then the third scenario is our net zero emissions by 2050, abbreviated as NZE scenario. And this scenario portrays a pathway, one of the pathways that the global energy sector could take to achieve net zero CO2 emissions by 2050, which is consistent with limiting long-term global warming to 1.5 degrees C with limited overshoot. So in the room with me today, I have 6 presenters from our demand and power supply units. I will hand over to them in a moment, but just a note that if you have any questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom application. But for now, I'm going to hand the floor to Martin Kweppers. Over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Hugh. To explain the outlook for electricity, I would like to start with the demand side. The electricity consumed in end-use sectors, buildings, industry, and transport. Since 2010, electricity demand has risen on average by almost 3% per year, twice as fast as the total energy demand in the same period. This has mainly been driven by an increase in industrial manufacturing, especially in light industry, and the consumption in buildings, for example, through deployment of appliances and air conditioners. A large part of this electricity demand growth is coming from economic growth, but electricity has also partially replaced fossil fuels and increased its share in the total final consumption from 17% in 2010 to 20% today. In our projections, in all 3 scenarios, the electricity demand growth is set to further accelerate, which leads to the main message in this year's WEO that we are moving at speed into the age of electricity. In the stated policy scenario, under current policy settings, electricity demand is growing by more than 40% until 2035. In the announced pledges scenario, where national energy and climate pledges are met, growth reaches 55%. And in the third scenario, the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario, portraying a global pathway to reach net zero emissions by 2050 in the energy sector, electrification is one of the most important drivers for emissions reduction, and electricity demand is growing by 70% until 2035. In the following slides, we will mainly focus on the stated policy scenario to highlight how current policy settings already form the age of electricity. Back to the metrics from the beginning of the slide, a more electrified system is also more efficient. In the STEP scenario, electricity demand grows 6 times faster than total demand until 2035, which is a significant increase to the doubling we've seen over the last years. But where is this growth happening? Electricity demand growth and the age of electricity is global and coming across all types of economies. In the last years, growth has been dominated by China, especially through the increase in residential consumption and structural shifts in industrial production towards less energy intensive and more electricity intensive goods. One example here is the increased manufacturing of solar PV panels and batteries. Together with the growth in other emerging and developing economies, electricity demand has increased by 600 terawatt hours each year over the past years, which is roughly the demand of South Korea. Under our STEPS projections, this is set to increase to almost 1,000 terawatt hours until 2035, where the equivalent to the demand of Japan will be added each year to global electricity demand. China still contributes almost 40% to this growth, but the role of other emerging and developing economies is increasing, especially half of this part is coming from India and Southeast Asia. Also, after a period of low growth in electricity demand, the trend in advanced economies is changing. Electricity demand is projected to rise again, which is mainly influenced by supporting policies across different sectors. The impact of these policies can also be seen in the share of electricity in total final consumption in advanced economies, which increases from 22% today to almost 30% by 2035. Globally, the share increases from 20% today to a quarter over the same period. This trend reinforces the important role of electricity as the second most important fuel in the end-use sectors and reducing the gap to the most important fuel, oil. But once again, China strongly dominates the global trend. China has already reached similar levels in electrification as Japan and Korea today, which are two highly electrified economies. By 2035, further electrification of all 3 sectors pushes the electrification rate of China to more than 1/3 of total final consumption in the steps. This makes China the most electrified major economy in the world. My colleague Oskaras will now explain the sectoral drivers behind these growth trends.
Thank you, Martin. So the total electricity demand across all sectors is set to increase by nearly 6,800 terawatt hours by 2030 in our STEP scenario. And this is more than the combined electricity demand of the United States and European Union. Around 40% of this growth comes from the building sector, which is then followed by industry, and transport is the third largest contributor, adding nearly 1,000 terawatt hours by 2030. There are also other sectors contributing to the growth, mainly agriculture and hydrogen production. Around 80% of all of this growth comes from conventional uses. So here we're talking mostly about industries, manufacturing, but also heating, cooling, other appliances demand in buildings. A lot of this comes from economic growth in emerging market and developing economies as additional 200 million people gain access to electricity grids by 2030. But we also have new uses that contribute to the electricity demand growth. Here we're talking mostly about electric vehicles, but also heat pumps and data centers with the rising use of AI. And if you look at the contribution to the electricity demand growth by application, we see that around 1/3 of the total electricity demand increase comes from light industries as demand for manufacturing and for products grows as economies across the world expand. And around 13% of the growth comes from electric vehicles as they become more affordable in some of the key consumer markets. And around 10% of the growth comes from space cooling, which is a result of a combination of both rising incomes, but also rising temperatures. Now, if we look at the technologies that are shaping the age of electricity, we see that conventional technologies will still be the key in increasing electricity share in the total energy demand that rises from around 15% today to 18% by 2030 in the STEPS scenario. Value added by industry, which is a key metric understanding the global electricity demand trends, as most of the value added in industry comes from already quite electrified light industries. So this value added in industry grows by around a quarter by 2030, with more than half of this growth coming from emerging market and developing economies outside of China. The air conditioner stock also showcases an impressive growth. It adds around 40% to the current stock of 1.5 billion units today globally. And this again depicts the impressive growth and the cooling needs in emerging market and developing economies, as these countries account for around 90% of the total increase by 2030 in the number of air conditioners. We also project that due to the rising incomes, the ownership rate of air conditioner also rises in the emerging market and developing economies, on average increasing from around 14% to 20% by 2030. Nonetheless, new energy technologies showcase an even more impressive rise by the end of the decade. They further electrify the end-use sectors and further shape the age of electricity. Here, I would like to look at heat pumps and electric cars, which are the two key technologies in electrifying buildings and transport sector, respectively. When it comes to heat pumps, their sales have already overtaken fossil fuel-based heating system sales in some of the key markets like France or the United States. And we project that by 2030, the global heat pump capacity rises by around 70%, reaching 1,900 gigawatts by the end of the decade. And yet, the electrification of the road transport is the most impressive when it comes to the sheer increase in the scale of these technologies. Currently, there are around 40 million electric cars on the road today, but this number rises to 230 million by 2030. And we project that by this year, almost every second car sold globally will be electric. And so by the mid-2020s, we project that EVs overtake rail as the biggest electricity consumer in the transport. And by 2030, electric cars alone reduce the global oil demand by more than 6 million barrels of oil per day. And with that, I'd like to pass the floor to Anthony, who will present you the electricity demand sensitivity analysis we conducted in this year's VO.
So with these drivers in mind, we'd like to explore some key uncertainties in the electricity outlook. First, on electric vehicles. So we've built higher and lower cases for the EV pace of growth at the regional level. So for instance, in the United States and in the European Union, there could be lower sales due to delayed policy action. On the opposite, in other emerging markets and developing economies, so outside China, the growth potential is strong because they've got limited ownership rates today. When we combine those analyses, it makes a range around steps of plus or minus 300 to 400 terawatt-hour, so around steps. Another key area of uncertainty is data center. So we know that data center electricity demand is set to grow in the coming decade. But there are several factors that make it challenging to project electricity demand growth. So for instance, the supply chain concentration or the efficiency improvement for chips, notably GPUs, with the rise of AI, or the permitting processes and issues for data center expansion. We can see that on absolute, that uncertainty is quite limited. However, if we compare that uncertainty with the overall data center demand growth, it's very significant. And that's something that was highlighted last week at the Global Energy and AI conference that we hosted at the IEA. The third area of uncertainty is on appliance efficiency, notably in emerging markets and developing economies. So the rate of efficiency improvement varied widely historically, so both over time and across regions. There are minimum energy performance standards that are key regulatory tools to enforce such improvements. However, their effect goes beyond. They could also incentivize appliance manufacturers in making efficient appliances, also for countries that don't have such minimum standards. And here we can see that the uncertainty range is one of the largest across all of our sensitivities. So it demonstrates the need for strong policy action on efficiency. Eventually, fourth area of analysis, heat waves. So 2024 is set to be the hottest year on record, and there were many heat waves that happened during that year. So in China, in India, in Mexico. One effect of such heat waves is that people buy more AC units. They tend to, basically, they want to stay cool during those periods, but they also tend to anticipate for the next heat wave as they get more frequent. And of course, during heat waves, AC units are used more, and they are used more often because heat waves get more frequent again. So in the outlook, we investigated the effect of more frequent, but also stronger and longer heat waves. And as a result, we can see that electricity demand could be 500 terawatt-hour higher than the steps by 2030. And it goes even to 700 by 2035. When we combine all those uncertainties, sensitivities together, we see that electricity demand growth in 2035 could be 15% higher than in the steps. But we can also see that electricity demand is set to increase rapidly and strongly in all of the cases. So we've seen that electricity demand is set to increase in the coming decade, but peak electricity demand is set to increase even faster than average electricity demand in some key regions. There is a need to anticipate the peak demand increase, and there is a need to mitigate it where feasible. So in advanced economies, for instance, by 2035, peak demand is set to increase by 15%. As you can see here, that's driven mostly through consumers using more electric heaters, but also with more ownership of consumers having more EVs. Overall, there is also an underlying stronger activity in all the different sectors and the overall electrification of the economy. Then, on the mitigation side, in order to curb peak demand increase, efficiency is a key tool. So as we've seen, minimum standards for appliances is one of the levers. We can also better insulate the buildings. We can also deploy more efficient industrial motors. On top of this, we should there is a need to incentivize flexibility for consumers. So for instance, by incentivizing them to shift their consumption outside of peak hours. And when combined, efficiency and flexibility, we've seen that peak growth is only 15%. And without such levers, it would be even more than 40% compared to 2023. In China, today, peak electricity demand is driven mostly by cooling in summertime. But they have a strong policy action on the electrification of space heating. So over time, winter peak demand is set to increase and eventually reach similar levels as summer peak demand. And that explains the somehow similar contribution of heating and cooling in average peak demand in 2035. Again, efficiency and flexibility are key tools to mitigate peak demand growth. And for instance, in China, 5% of demand flexibility by 2035 can save 100 gigawatts of generation capacity. The strongest peak growth is said to be in over emerging markets and developing economies. And by 2035, on average over those regions, peak demand increases by 75%. And 1/3 of peak demand in 2035 is only from cooling. when we read that analysis in comparison with the sensitivities that we just made, it shows again the relevance of strong action on efficiency, plus the need to anticipate the effect of heat waves and mitigate those where feasible. So with that, I pass it on to Yasmin to discuss electricity supply.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, colleagues, for this great overview of what the age of electricity means on the demand side of things. And now I'll focus more on the supply side of things and what are the sources of electricity to meet this impressive demand growth. Actually, I'll start with something quite spectacular, is the largest transformation that we are seeing in the energy system is this solar PV and wind growth. So multiplied by 7 for solar PV by 2035 and a tripling for wind. What is behind that is, of course, increasing support for these technologies. We have seen above 150 countries having policies supporting solar PV and wind, but it's also about the economic side of things. Costs have been down since 2010, minus 90% for solar PV and minus 70 for wind. So what does it mean? It means that today solar PV and wind projects are the cheapest sources of electricity in most markets today. And clearly this is a big driving force behind this growth that you see on the screen. Of course, this is complemented by continuous growth of hydro and nuclear. They are today the largest source of clean electricity today, and they continue to grow under stated policy and current market trends. So when we put all this together, it's a kind of a revolution. The picture you see here is a completely new picture. Put together, all low emission sources would represent 2/3 of electricity generation by 2035, which is kind of a reversal of what we have today, with coal being the largest source of electricity by far, about 36% today. We have over 9,000 units of coal all around the world. They are the largest source of emission from the power sector. But under stated policies, what we see is a reversal of this trend. The increase of low emission electricity is fast enough to put coal into decline. So now I'll focus a little bit more and have a closer look at this clean power growth. And actually, I'd like to rewind the clock back to 2015. At that time, low emission electricity represented about 1/3 of total electricity generation. And indeed, solar PV and wind here in that picture were less than 5% on average globally. But already you can see different region dynamics. We see the EU leading the way, but also Latin America for the first one, mainly thanks to nuclear, hydro, bioenergy, and other Latin America with hydro. And since then, we've seen things moving. The biggest development was the rise of China as a global market leader in the deployment of clean energy technology. But at the same time, as we've seen earlier, the growth of electricity in China has been quite significant. So even if in China we've seen a record every year of solar PV deployment, for example, in 2023, it was installed in China the equivalent of what was installed in 2022 for all the world. So quite impressive number. But as you can see, this is not enough to keep the pace with growth. So globally, with 40% of low emission in 2023, we are still not keeping pace with the demand growth. But looking forward, many countries are pushing much further, going faster, and we see clean power getting up to speed actually with the demand growth in most markets. I mentioned some of the leaders, but actually looking further down the pack, regions such as Japan, India, Africa had made huge progress. We see globally, I mentioned 2/3 of low emission globally, which means that it's a 70% increase compared to today. But those regions, Japan, India, Africa, but also China, they have seen a doubling of this share across the same amount of time. Now, in terms of contribution, of course, each region would follow their own path depending on resources and depending on policy priorities. But what is clear everywhere is that solar PV and wind are leading the way. The two have a combined contribution of above 50% in many of the major markets across the world. And this means that the power system would need to operate differently in many regions to accommodate their variable nature. And my colleague Julie will now tell you more about this.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. So indeed, we saw that electricity systems are changing. So we saw that on the demand side with the large growth that is to be happening, driven by electrification and the development of new end uses. We also saw that with the changes happening on the supply side, with the increasing penetration of variable renewables, most specifically. And all of these changes are driving the need for electricity systems to be more flexible, both from the supply and the demand side. But maybe the most efficient way to really capture the magnitude of these changes is to look at a real system. And so here we can have the example of India on the system of today, so 2023, and for our stated policy scenario in 2035. And so if we look at an average day, first we see, if we look at the demand, we see that by 2035, we have demand almost doubling compared to today's level, driven by the development of the new end users, as was explained by my colleagues before. And then if we have a look at solar PV and wind, we see that these are also changing dramatically, and especially solar PV and wind, almost reaching 40% of total electricity generation in India by that time. And so for demand and supply, renewable supply to be balanced at all times, we need other sources to fill the gap. And so as we can see for today, most of this is done by conventional power plants such as hydro power plants, but also thermal power plants, so comprising coal power plants, gas, and then other baseload type of generation like nuclear, for example. In 2035, we see batteries and storage in general, so batteries, pump storage, filling the gap, especially during peak hours happening early evening and early morning. And these storage devices will have to charge, and so they are mostly charging during the day when electricity prices are lowest, mostly because of the excess of renewable electricity generation. And then we have demand response that will shift parts of the load to make the best use of these lowest prices during the day, and also to move the demand away from the more expensive peak hours during the night. So overall, we see that the systems in 2035 needs to be more flexible to cope with these changes that we've been describing. And so to summarize this, we have the metric of flexibility, and flexibility needs both. So from the short-term perspective, what we call short-term here would be hour-to-hour changes, and on the seasonal side of things, because also we are seeing these imbalances on the seasonal time frame. And so what is really important to notice is that these needs for flexibility are rising, and are rising faster than the average demand in general. And so in India, it's a particularly striking increase for short-term needs, 6 times the level of today. But this is happening all over the world, all across regions and countries, although at different magnitudes, depending on the electrification rates and also the growth of renewable generation. And if we look then at the supply for these flexibility needs that we see all around the world, so as I was saying for today, most of this flexibility is met by a mix of thermal dispatchable power plants and hydro power plants. But by 2035, we see the growing role of batteries and demand response driven by smart charging of electric vehicles, or also smarter heating and cooling devices that help to meet the short-term flexibility needs almost by half. And on the seasonal timescale, we see that hydro and thermal are still the key provider for this type of flexibility, although hydro becomes a more and more important provider. And now, if we have a look at the total system cost for electricity and the impact of energy transition on these costs, the important aspect here to see is that the energy transition is an opportunity to have stable or even lower costs for total electricity in the future. And then if we have a look at the cost structure of these electricity system costs, so comprising everything from the development of grids to the development of new generation to also maintenance and operation, we see that the energy transition is an opportunity for all major economies to have lower costs in the future. And then on the cost structure side, we see that electricity will become more capital intense than it is today. But this increase in capital recovery costs is compensated by a decrease in both emissions, but also fossil fuel costs, which is particularly true in regions that are importing expensive fossil fuels. And then, so last but not least, one very important thing on these costs is that, so these costs are not electricity prices. And one of the key challenges of energy transition will also be to make sure that these reductions that we see in the cost are indeed transferred to a consumer tariff to ensure affordable electricity for everyone. And on this, I will pass the floor to my colleague Brent.
Thanks, Julie. To close, so final two slides here to focus on overall kind of zooming back out in terms of emissions and then on investment for the power sector. So the first is a bit of a sobering reality that actually the power sector emissions at the world level have been increasing in recent years. We often think about the transitions that are underway. My colleague Yasmin described the rise in low emissions and renewables that have been going on. But electricity demand, as we've heard, is also growing very fast. So when we put that all together, actually the power sector is still the largest emitting sector in the world at close to 15 gigatons of emissions every year, but is poised for these transitions that we've discussed. So in the stated policy scenario, that rollout of renewables led by solar and wind, complemented by nuclear and other technologies, means that we see a 30% reduction in overall emissions from the power sector by 2035. Obviously, this is very good news. We see the peak. We are essentially at the top of the emissions mountain here today. Hopefully that peak is either this year or next year at the latest, but then we are headed into structural decline, which is quite good news. But we need to go much faster. We have the technologies. We know they're cost effective. We can move faster. In the net zero scenario, we see emission reductions in the power sector, so emissions declining by 80% by 2035. And leading the way in terms of emission reductions, that means electrification has that much more impact in terms of reducing emissions. And this is very much in our pathway to fulfill the COP28 pledges and get on a path to net zero emissions by 2050. Now, there are four key pillars to accomplish that. One, sort of to move into the COP28 pathway, full implementation case, which is consistent with our net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. First, we need to triple renewables by 2030. Next, we need to increase energy storage, including battery storage, by 6 times by 2030. We need also to build out electricity grids. That means building new grids and expanding networks, but also digitalizing, modernizing, and upgrading the existing infrastructure we have. So we actually need to upgrade and build out 55 million kilometers of transmission and distribution just in the period to 2035, which is a major undertaking considering today we only have 80 million kilometers in the world. That's taken over 100 years to build. And a fourth pillar is also on the nuclear power front. We see for countries open to the technology, it will be important to expand the use, complementing the role of renewables, complementing that expansion of storage, so more than doubling by 2050. Now, all of this expansion drives then an increase in investment. And that's the final slide for our webinar here today, is already today, the power sector is a $1 trillion market, and it passed that mark just in the year 2022. And it's been rising very rapidly in recent years. We see the vast majority of this investment is in renewables and grids, and this is set to continue expanding. So by 2035, or by 2030 even, we'd see investment at the world level in the power sector going to $1.7 trillion per year. Now, keep in mind today that actually the power sector is already a larger point of investment than fossil fuels combined. So we're seeing this shift of where investment in energy goes. It was long dominated by fossil fuels, is now shifting towards electricity and particularly clean electrification. But again, to shift paths, we have to increase that level of investment by another 50% to move towards net zero by 2050, to accelerate transitions, to fulfill also country level pledges, nationally determined contributions, and those targets set out and deliver overall ambitions on the path to reaching zero by 2050. So here we're talking about investment reaching $2.5 trillion by 2030. That's per year. And that means not only shifting from fossil fuels, but also expanding the base of investors and the base of investment to fuel this transition. So with that, I'd like to then turn back to Hugh, and we will be taking Q&A here in a moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all my excellent speakers for some very interesting content there. We're in the Q&A section now. A reminder that you can paste some questions in the Zoom app in the Q&A section if you'd like to ask some. We've already had some in. Also, just a reminder, we are recording this. A recording will be available later online. So actually, Brent, while you're here on the camera, I'm going to start with a few questions for you.
Okay.
So for electricity supply, do you see any technologies that are under development on the horizon that could cause a shift in this outlook?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. And thanks very much for the question and all those following here today. I mean, this is something we track very closely at the International Energy Agency. Technologies as they develop, we have a tracking clean energy progress work and stream of work that's been ongoing for many years. We actually have two particular technologies we're looking at very closely right now. Next generation geothermal, which is actually will be released in a report just the end of this week. So on Friday, 13th of December, we will release a report that looks at how technology development on the oil and gas side has actually unlocked a huge potential around the world for enhanced geothermal systems and advanced geothermal systems, which to give a preview of that is taking a technology which was once thought of as being in just a few specific locations, and with the technology now available, can be something that geothermal can be available in almost every country in the world and at scale. And so it's about driving down the cost of that, but that could make a very substantial impact on the outlook, particularly for a dispatchable clean source. And we are also in the midst of following and working on a report on nuclear financing, which includes analysis about small modular reactors. This is another area where this is a significant technology development. We see it as very promising. The first small modular reactors we anticipate to be coming to the market in advanced economies around 2030. And then for the potential for those is enormous once the costs and the technology is a bit more proven. But we assess that this could be something that gives more options to more countries because it can scale down the barrier to entry for nuclear power, lowering that upfront investment to get into that market. So this is something, these are two that we're watching very closely, but of course there are many more, from long duration storage technologies, heat storage, and as many know, the IEA is putting out many reports on these technologies on a very regular basis. So I hope those a few points for you.
Great, thank you. And another one that I'm sure many people will be curious to hear a response on, which is around the IEA may have underestimated the rapid growth of solar PV. How do you respond to that, and how we might be addressing that going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. Yeah, this is a common question and one we hear, and I think there's a few important clarifications to be made here. I mean, for one, so something that's been pointed at is that over the years in the World Energy Outlook, and this is my 14th World Energy Outlook, in fact, that the outlook for solar PV has continuously been ratcheted up. Now, often this is described in a certain way, but I think what we need to think about is that each of the stated policy scenarios, or previously it was the current policy scenario that we put out, they represent a view of the path ahead of us and an assessment of where the policies and the technology would lead at the time. If policymakers make a decision after that point to increase support, for example, for solar PV or for wind or for nuclear power, we then incorporate that into the next edition of the World Energy Outlook. And I think this is actually really that ratcheting up of solar PV projections is something that we should celebrate. This is something that means that we have driven down the cost of solar PV in large part because of continued and strengthened policy support. So in major markets from China, the United States, within the European Union, there have been continuous and steady gains and improvements and strengthening of that policy support, which has then enabled solar PV to move down the cost curve and the market to expand. 10 years ago, solar PV was certainly not one of the cheapest technologies, which it is today. And that is in part both to this technology, moving down the technology learning curve, but also that policy support. So we shouldn't separate those. A second point is that we still need to go faster, right? So we have, in our stated policy scenario, we've set new records in 2023. We've now passed over 400 gigawatts of additions this year. In our stated policy scenario, that increases by 3/4 to 2030. But as we saw, that's still not enough. We've got to go much further. In our net zero scenario, for example, or to deliver the COP28 pledge of tripling renewables, solar PV needs to approach 1,000 gigawatts. It needs to be at least 900 gigawatts of additions by then. And I think one last point here is that we often focus on solar PV and wind, but then often other renewables are a bit left behind, is that we need a whole package of technologies to be available to drive transitions. There's been a lot of focus on solar and wind, which is great, but we also need to build out those dispatchable sources like next generation geothermal, like hydro. We also mentioned nuclear power. So a broad, balanced portfolio of low emission technologies will help deliver the most cost-effective transitions.
Okay, thank you. All right, next question, which I'm going to hand to Martin, who's just off camera, so we'll squeeze in, is around, which is split from my screen. So what are the top bottlenecks that you would see in making the shift towards electricity, Martin?
I think it can, of course, there are bottlenecks from the demand side and also from the supply side, system side. On the demand side is obviously the adoption of technologies, electric vehicles and heat pumps for the transport and building sector, which partially depend on policies. And in certain countries, the slowdown has been observed in recent months on the sales of those technologies. Nevertheless, there are also positive news, for example, for EV sales in China, which are still rising rapidly and showing that there's also economic potential of these technologies to be adopted. So it's, of course, a bottleneck on the policy side, but also the market shows they can be adopted. Similar story for industry, where industrial heat pumps are still maturing technology, and adoption can be supported by policies and also training for sort of more efficient applications. and increasing electrification, especially in low and medium temperature heat processes in industrial manufacturing. Then there's the point of efficiency, which can be a bottleneck. Anthony showed the slides of the peak. So efficiency, higher efficiency appliances, especially air conditioners, which have a huge impact on the system in the future, are important. And less efficient appliances, of course, mean a higher peak, higher demand, which then needs more supply technologies, potentially fossil fuel based. So efficiency is a key bottleneck also on this, which we often call the first fuel in the International Energy Agency. And then, of course, there's the grid and storage. The grid, very important also from the demand side to enable the grid being able to take all the additional demand. Also having the infrastructure for new customers, and the storage to handle the flexibility between PV, wind, and the demand side. Of course, demand side flexibility is.
Thank you. So another question we had was, and maybe Julie, you can take it if you can get on camera. I'm not sure, or Brent could, but it's around that question around the daytime peak of solar PV exceeding the peak load. There's a question around where that would go. Does it go towards the base load? Just give some more details around that aspect.
Yes, sure, of course. So indeed, the periods where with the excess generation can happen more and more frequently with the as more as the share of solar PV increases in electricity systems, and that's where storage and flexibility in general will play a key role, also to make the best use of these low price period. And so, but it can be done with storage technologies, but also in maybe in a long future, electrolyzers coupled with the electricity markets where they can, of course, use this electricity to produce hydrogen. And then if generation, of course, is way above the demand, it's also something that will happen more and more, the curtailment of this excess generation. But this also has to be seen as a way not to, as solar PV gets cheaper, it's not always a good idea to oversize all the infrastructure to cope with these high peak of solar PV generation, for example, also wind generation. So a bit of what we can call strategic curtailment can also help dealing with these excess periods.
Great, thank you. Okay, so there was a question around green hydrogen and if that could be integrated into the electricity generation systems to support marine transports. Yasmin or Brent, would you?
Sure, yeah, happy to jump in there. I think the point of, low emissions hydrogen, so sometimes called green hydrogen, but we here at the IEA are working also on this categorization. So prefer to refer to it as low emissions hydrogen, where then that, for everyone, that's where it's produced from low emission sources like renewable energy or others. So then its use within the power system is one. We think of it in multiple ways. So there's direct use of low emissions hydrogen in power plants. This could be something that's used for flexibility in the long term. You can currently use low emissions hydrogen in some gas turbines, for example. Increasingly, new gas turbines are designed to use higher and higher shares and even pure low emissions hydrogen. So that's something we will see. We see that as a relatively small market because of the fact that it would be used for flexibility, and so in fact is not providing bulk power, for example. But the question, I think, was also around marine sources, maybe powering ports. I think there will be a variety of uses for low emissions hydrogen, and that's the way we think about it is there are very good uses for it in industry or other applications where combustion is important to reach high temperatures. So industry is one, but I think in particular applications and even marine powering ships themselves is another application. So I think as we see it as a premium fuel going forward, even with very low cost renewables, for example, to build out or to produce the low emissions hydrogen. But then this premium fuel would mainly go into sort of premium applications. So I think that's certainly the way we think about it. I would invite readers here to also look at other IEA reports like the Global Hydrogen Review, which is looking at the market and the new applications that are being put in place for low emissions hydrogen.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're going to direct the next question to Anthony, so he gets ready with his camera. So one or two questions around the role of artificial intelligence and data centers. Obviously, that's very much on our radar. We had our AI conference last week, had over 500 participants there. But the questions kind of focus around, there's a lot of talk about skyrocketing demand, but our messaging is that it's not actually that big. Could you maybe expand on that a little more, our thinking behind that?
Sure. So it's a very topical issue. Thanks for the question. If we start with today, basically, data center electricity demand makes around 1% of total electricity demand globally. So we do see a strong growth in demand for data center services, and that's partly because of traditional services, streaming, etc., but also largely in some countries, for instance, in the United States, because of artificial intelligence. So on the other side, historically, we've seen strong efficiency improvements in the last 10 years, and that completely compensated the increase in service demand somehow from data centers. So electricity demand was flat. There is strong certainty in the fact that efficiency is not going to outpace the increased service demand from data centers in the next years. Hence, the electricity demand is going to increase. But still, efficiency gains remain strong over time. And there are some very good technologies or solutions to mitigate the electricity demand growth. So for instance, liquid cooling is one of such solutions, but we can also improve the efficiency of GPUs. And NVIDIA released a 70% increase in efficiency for their last generation of GPUs, or improve also the design of the software directly. So there is strong uncertainty, as we just discussed, and we are going to build a report in spring next year that will focus on such growth, and you will have likely most of the answers to some of the questions. And overall, we should still highlight that electricity demand does not increase at the same pace everywhere from data centers, and it can lead to very strong localized issue for the electricity network. Thank you.
Thank you. And you were talking a bit of there's certainly a lot of uncertainties in data centers, and you were showing some of our sensitivity cases. One of the questions is, isn't the uncertainty really a lot larger than those sensitivity cases that we had? How would you respond to that?
So that's very good points. In the outlook this year, we investigated some of the sensitivities that we consider to be the most topical ones. It does not capture all the uncertainties that our outlooks could cover. So first, for instance, they are framed by the steps. So we have somehow the same assumptions on population, on how the economies are going to develop. We should also say that in total, we've got 15 sensitivities. So we try to investigate really some of the key elements of the scenario. And even when we combine all those sensitivities in the same direction, then the increase is only between 3 to 5% on each of the fuels, including electricity. So indeed, there are much wider uncertainties. We don't know anything about how the geopolitical situation is going to evolve, if there will be new or changed policies. And most importantly, some of such policies could push towards one of our other scenarios, for instance, the APS or the NZC.
Great, thank you. We are getting close to closing out. I think we have time for at least one more question. So Oscar, I'm going to direct it to you if you get primed with your camera. But it surrounds another very topical subject, which are EVs, electric vehicles. So there's news reports in the media out there saying that maybe people are falling out of love with EVs. They're not growing as quickly as expected. Do you really think the growth of EVs will be as much as we think it is?
Thank you, Hugh. That's a good question. IEA is quite certain about the continuous rise of electric vehicle sales. If we look at the first half of 2024, we see that globally there were around 7 million electric cars sold, which is around a quarter more than what was seen in the first half of 2024. We see continuous increases in EV sales in the US, which is around 10% compared to the first half of 2023, around 15% increase in the United Kingdom. And you also see that sales are quite strongly rising in some of the emerging market and developing economies like Brazil, Indonesia, Mexico as well. And so we have looked at where our projections stand compared to many other publications and many other organizations. And this is by far not the most ambitious projections compared to some others, and surely not the most negative projections. And so we really are standing somewhere in the middle of where many other organizations are seeing the EV market growing, and surely this year is in a place to set a new record for global EV sales.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more question about energy storage, in fact, and as we talked about batteries and hydropower being used for storage to balance against solar and wind. How exactly do you see those two playing out? Maybe Brent, you want to take that?
Yeah. No, thanks you. Thanks for the question as well. I mean, but energy storage in general, we see as one of the most dynamic parts of power systems and certainly what's happening in the market today. So we released earlier this year also a special report on batteries, not just focused on energy storage, but also electric vehicles, going into also the critical minerals side and the needs there. So for those interested, I invite you to look for that report. But in that, we specified very much and looked into the applications for battery storage versus other forms. And I think there's a really important distinguishing point that given the way batteries, here I'm talking about lithium-ion batteries, which have been the foremost battery technology chemistry used in electric vehicles, that's really driven down their cost 90% in the last decade or so. And that has made them actually the most dominant form of energy storage as well. So we're seeing that market really explode the last few years. It's going to double again in the year 2024 for battery storage. We see that as a central part of the overall energy storage picture, but it's largely serving these hour-to-hour short-term flexibility needs. So the average duration of a battery storage project is about 2 hours in the world, meaning that it can output its maximum level for only 2 hours in a row before it has to charge again. So that means it's really fit to be filling the gaps that Julie described for a few hours within the day, but on a regular basis, virtually every day. That's very different than hydropower, for example, and pumped hydropower in particular, which has longer durations, most often 10 hours or more, and often up to hundreds of hours of storage, which means it could operate at its maximum output for 100 hours plus, which then means it's more suitable for week-to-week storage or even seasonal storage. And then if we think of even large reservoir hydro that exists in the world, that storage is even longer. And so these are roles, if we think of time scales, they're not necessarily competing head-to-head here, but in the end, this application, we will need many forms of storage, meeting those short-term flexibility needs and longer-term flexibility needs, whether that's week-to-week or season-to-season or even year-to-year. So in most cases, this is not a question of either or, this is a question of both and. And here, for sure, we are going to need more battery storage technologies. Also, sodium ion is a new chemistry coming. We'll need more flow batteries, for example, other forms, heat, gravity storage. There's room for all of these storage technologies in the power systems of tomorrow. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, we are at the top of the hour. We are out of time. So thank you, everyone, for attending. Just a quick reminder, this was the first of 3. We have the second tomorrow called about the fuels outlook. And the third and final will be on Wednesday, people-centered energy transitions, both of those at 2 p.m. Paris time. In the meantime, have a great rest of the day, and thank you for attending. Bye.